second speaker today is Giles. He's Associate Professor of Spanish at Indiana University. I particularly use his book, The Laughter of the Saints, in my class on humor. I found it very helpful. He's also published widely in other areas, the LDA, Milagros de Nuestra Señora, Guzmán de Alcarache, Pasarillo de Tormes, Celestina, Borracho. His present project is a book entitled Liberate Amulets in Medieval and Early Modern Iberia. And he will speak to us this morning on Traduciendo Oración, Heroic Translation, and Spatial Movement in the Libre Grammar.
Thank you, Connie. And once again, I wanted to reiterate thanks to the organizers and for putting on this wonderful conference, one-of-a-kind conference. And it's a real pleasure just to be here with so many friends and esteemed colleagues. It's a really great occasion. In what is a now classic article, Jack Walsh made a significant breakthrough in our understanding of the potential relationship between 13th century Guadalajara poetry and the Libro de Amor. In his close reading of texts composed by MESTER CLERECÍA poets who preceded the Arcipreste de Ita, Walsh identified numerous verses that seemed to be echoed and ironically recontextualized in the Libro. For example, he examined retellings and allusions to the Libro de Genre, when a heroic epitaph appears to provide a model for praising the deceased old Bach or the conventos, or the triumphant emperor of legend seems to provide an intertextual precedent for the irreverent victories and triumphs of Carnal y Amor. While we will never know to what extent possible incidents of lost parody, as he calls it, would have been fully recognizable to early readers of the 14th century book, there is little doubt that peninsular audiences familiar with the tradition of mono-rhyming quatrains, in a more general sense, would have been capable of picking up on Juan Ruiz's subversive manipulations of what was becoming a somewhat dated metrical formula. What Walsh showed was how the archpriest exploited the visible possibilities of works from the MESTER CLERECÍA as a century-old form of storytelling that contained formulas now ripe for parody. The archpriest's predecessors, in their approach to source material, attempted to resolve potential ambivalence and the pitfalls of language, while most critics agree that Juan Ruiz's book is about exploring contraries and the openness of signification, among other things. Apart from engaging in a more theoretical, broadly conceived studies of medieval parody, more recent scholarship, especially the work of Julian Weiss, has shed further light on ideological and intellectual contexts that inform the works of Perseo and other poets associated with the MESTER CLERECÍA school. Other scholars, building on the earlier findings of Francisco Rico, have re-examined the way in which this vernacular metrical form was influenced by clerical exercises and strategies of reading and composition, while at the same time engaging with or sometimes participating in oral literary traditions. Thinking of Pablo Ancos, there's lots of people here who worked on these things. In light of this scholastic context, it seems possible that the parody first identified by Walsh targets not only the self-declared purposes of earlier poet translators who sought to cultivate a way of writing defined by regularity in its versification and a claim to purity and its moralizing content. I would suggest that the archpriest also ironically imitates earlier methods of translatio and interpretatio, also suggested, I think, earlier yesterday by Emily Carmolano, imaginatively exposing and reveling in the slipperiness of vernacularization itself. My focus then is not on the particularities of 13th century Castilian poets and their school, but instead the manner in which the archpriest's approach to particular Latin texts subverts the traditional aims of pre-modern translation shared in and exemplified in the context of medieval Iberia by MESTER CLERECÍA poets. The background and fundamental aims of translation in medieval culture have been fruitfully studied by Rita Copeland. She traces methods and examples of allegoresis in which Greek and later Latin texts, both Christian and pagan, were commented on, explicated, and retransmitted by translators who developed tools such as amplification as well as paraphrasis and abbreviation. These processes designed in Pauline terms to be faithful to the spirit of the text, can already be seen in Latin summaries and adaptations of Greek legends concerning pagan heroes such as Alexander the Great, Apollonius of Tyre, and his heroic wife and daughter, whose stories were increasingly made to reveal Christian truths during the Middle Ages. Translations were produced as acts of interpretation that appropriated and recast language from source text, recontextualizing their format and meaning for latter readers and audiences. Critics of the Libro Alexandre and Libro Apolonio have shown how Castilian poets engaged in similar processes, especially by amplifying their sources through the introduction of further doctrinal, liturgical, Christological references and characterizations, as has been shown by Marina Brownlee, also Matthew Testing, among others. Berceo, too, engages in numerous amplifications and interpretive alterations of Latin sources, teasing out devotional, theological, and folkloric resonances, as scholars, a number of scholars have shown. The Libro de Amor famously begins with a tale of mistranslation that is concerned with issues relating to linguistic mediation, most recently studied by Vincent Marletta, who also analyzes corruptions of Arabic in the text. The Greeks and Romans not only set the stage for the ambivalence or multivalence of love in the poem, but also the problem of misappropriating language and text through poetic interpretatio and translatio, or hermeneutic transfer from one arbitrary sign system to another, and from one discursive space to another. As Michael Jurley has pointed out, such semiotic misunderstandings as words pass from one language or linguistic register to another recalls Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana, a text that might have influenced the archpriest's playful rendering of the Greco-Roman debate in signs. What interests me is how the archpriest recycles and inverts the ostensibly purifying methods of 13th century poet translators with their many insertions of Latin prayers and liturgical matter, and the recurrent themes of pilgrimage and spiritual itineraries. As we will see, the narrator and his characters not only move from Latin to Spanish in ways that consciously corrupt an elevated language of auctoritas, but also represent movements from sacred spaces of prayer to spaces mapped out in an impure vernacular and always susceptible to creative intertextual profanation. Of course, the danger of corruption through misunderstanding or misinterpretation is not absent from portrayals of the Romero Apollonio moving toward redemption, Alexandre making his way to Jerusalem and the Far East, not to mention the wayward pilgrims and churchgoers of Berceo's collection. The representation of these places and movements, however, is conceived within the parameters of MESTER that, broadly speaking, sought to vernacularize sin pecado. In the Libro, advertent misappropriations and impure movements in space and across language barriers have been studied in episodes like the Bach seduction of the Baker Woman Cruz, the nefarious canonical hours of Amor, the archpriest's sinful trek through the Sierra, and a later mock religious procession in honor of carnal love, among other episodes. In what remains of this talk, I would like to closely examine the archpriest's penchant for creative mistranslation in a comparatively lesser study scene in which the narrator lusts for a woman he sees at prayer. You see how this evocation of a specific time and place that is at once blessed and profane carries the kind of sinless linguistic transfer from Latin to Spanish that characterized 13th century MESTER de CLERECÍA poetry. This intriguing episode, which received relatively little critical attention, refers to a celebration on the Rogative Feast of St. Mark, when the narrator falls in love with a devout woman after seeing her pray before an image of Christ in Majesty, La Majestad. Described in a rubric from the Salamanca manuscript, de como el arcipreste fue enamorado de una doña que vio estar haciendo oración. On April 25th, known as the day of major rogation on the liturgical calendar, the narrator asks his go-between protagomentos to make contact with the alluring lady and deliver her some of his verses. The old bard approaches with heightened caution, fearing that the prayerful woman might mistreat her. Specifically, protagomentos recalls a previous mission on behalf of her client, when an unnamed Moorish woman literally or figuratively drove her away with a vara, a stick or staff. Said to be already married, fue la doña con otro ya casada. This lady is unwilling to embark on a new illicit affair and rejects the offer made by the archpriest through his poetic gift to her. His verses refer to the woman as a turtle dove from the kingdom of Rolas, a play on words that is suggestive of spinning wheels from the verb. The poem then urges her to move on to new espousals. Pablo la intense study of this section of the Libro was carried out by James Burke, who notes that the spring setting of the feast was a time marked by processions and litanies in which believers beseeched God to safeguard their crops from being damaged by blight, insects, and adverse weather. The archpriest describes this setting at the start of the episode, emphasizing that his adventure took place on the day of major vocation, when every year the Holy Church sets off on a collective procession. Día era de San Marcos, por fiesta señalada, toda la Santa Iglesia faz procesiones honrada, de las mayores del año de cristianos loada, acacióme una aventura, la fiesta non pasada. Later, the month of April is depicted in the poem's temporal allegory as a nobleman decked out in flowers in a time of growing wheat and rye and of frightening thunderstorms. Burke finds that Vocation Day is particularly fitting for the archpriest Ventura, since it was also a time when couples traditionally acted out future or hoped-for nuptial vows, leading to associations in popular culture and surviving folklore with notions of marital infidelity and the threat of marital infidelity. Rituals involving facetious espousals continue to be celebrated on April 25th in later centuries, as early modern prohibitions specifically condemn a long-standing custom of giving license to the celebration of desposorios imaginarios during this time of year. Drawing on the work of Julio Carabaroja, Burke observes that major vocation on the feast of St. Mark began as the Christianization of an annual pagan holiday known as the Robigalia, in honor of the agricultural god Robigus, when celebrants supplicated this deity to protect their wheat from fungal disease. Burke sees this setting as a subversive setting for the narrator's attempted seduction through the persuasions of his aged procuress, of the prayerful woman who is further depicted as a widow when Protagomentos tries to persuade her to take advantage of her freedom by entering into a secret and consoling love affair outside the official bounds of marriage. Señora, pues yo digo de casamiento far, que más mal suelta está la viuda que mal casar, más vale tener algún pobre mucho ensalado, que más vale buen amigo que mal marido velado. This in keeping with the depictions of widows in the poem, notably Andrina, whose door is broken down by the lustful suitor Menor. Burke points out that the turtle dove represented virtuous widowhood in medieval culture, based on interpretations of the figure of the turtur from the Song of Songs. My aim is to further unpack the meaning of major vocation processions in the Libro in the context of his spell seduction of the devout Tortorilla, and consider how this episode sheds light on the significance of translation and spatial representations and movements in the poem as a whole. The annual litanies on April 25th were known in Spain as rogativas, based on the Latin word rogare, to ask, plead for. Importantly, the processions undertaken on this day were not only intended to bestow a series of blessings to ensure the fertility of crops planted in the vicinity, in keeping with Burke's findings, but also to mark and sanctify boundaries and spaces that surrounded churches. These perambulations through the countryside on the feast, in Spain as elsewhere in Europe, were used to mark out the limits of the parish in the absence of reliable maps, and were headed by local church leaders who typically carried a staff signifying ecclesiastical authority. Records of this practice have been studied by a number of Spanish historians and folklorists. Apart from disputes over boundaries, they have found condemnations that attest to abuses, including what is described as illicit coupling and profane revelries that took place during the processions, which sometimes involved overnight journeys to local shrines. In some parts of Europe, a tradition developed that is known in English as beating the bounds, in which the limits of the parish were marked into memory, as it were, through outbreaks of festive violence, as participants stopped at important sites along the parochial border and struck each other with sticks. It is possible that the poet alludes ironically to a related custom when Protagomentos recalls being threatened with a vara. Undoubtedly, the archpriest's eroticized portrayal of the celebration revolves around the connotations of a springtime movement through space, together with supplications intoned on this particular feast, and thus engages in a kind of parodic translation of rogative prayer. The liturgy for the ritual featured a repeated appeal, te rogamos, followed by a request for protection and purification of the land and of Christians who cultivated it. Quote, preserved in holy religion all clerics who have taken orders, we plead of you, te rogamos, that you might restore to the unity of the church all who have strayed from the truth and lead all infidels to the light of the gospel. We plead of you, te rogamos. This is repeated rogamos. might lift up our minds to heavenly desires, we plead of you. That you would give and preserve the fruits of the earth, we plead of you, te rogamos. Similar to other parodic interludes in the poem, such as the canonical hours celebrated by Amor, the narrator here engages in a subversive misapplication of this language from the standpoint of a priest who has taken holy orders and allowed himself to be led astray by a lowly, frustrated desire to harvest the fruits of carnal lust. This can be seen as in his initial description of the praying woman, leading to the itinerary of go-between hired to promote his own lustful intentions. Vi estar una doña hermosa de verdad, rogando muy devota. Rogué a la mi vieja que hubiese piedad, y que anduviese por mis pasos de caridad. Ella hizo mi ruego. In this way, the poet recasts a liturgical movement through space meant to bless the earth, its inhabitants, and fruits as a vernacular plea for amorous mobility, conveying a restless need to move on to new espousals. De mudar vuestro amor para ver nuevas bodas. Folklorists have recorded a number of orally preserved rogations in Castilian that continue to be used on the Feast of St. Mark well into the 20th century, and that feature the repeated plea, rogamos, along with prayers for rain and a bountiful crop. Characteristically, the archpriest's vernacular rogatione is centered on the fleshly prospects of harvesting a devout widow, as opposed to fertile spaces marked through the April 25th processions receiving a divine benediction. As a turtle dove, the object of his affections responds in accordance with the figure of the widowed church in the Song of Songs, who remains faithful to the memory of her beloved, steadfastly unwilling to give herself to anyone other than the bridegroom Christ. Fuera doña con otro ya casada. The tortoria refuses to engage in sinful movement or allow the wheels of seduction to turn in the archpriest's corrupt reino de Rodas. This is opposed to the Crusader kingdom of Rhodes, an idealized Christian stronghold occupied by the Hospitallers, known as the Knights of Rhodes, at the time the Libra was written, composed. Describing the continent love signified by the widowed turtle dove, medieval writers quoted Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, calling on women to abide, permanent, in the refuge of chastity. Bestiaries link this virtuous space to the seduced habitat of a bird not given to taking flight capriciously, but instead known for remaining secluded on high summits, in desolate places, and deserted woodlands. The turtle dove would avoid the sort of unrighteous wandering that Alfonso de Madrigal describes in his 15th century Confesional. En el andar pecamos, tenemos puestos los pies para ir a comer, para beber, a fornicar, or hacer otros males. Medieval preachers frequently warned of this danger, as Maria Corti has shown, drawing on the topic of mobility versus immobility. Critics have observed how images of consciously misguided movement inform the Libro, its opening thema from the Psalms, I will show you the path you should walk. Uses of the word rogar in the poem play into a central metaphor, which, apart from depicting a failed attempt to get a prayerful woman to move on, compares the text itself and the desire of its narrator to a peña, or ball, put into continual motion through amorous mediation, as Protagonentos makes clear. Quiero me aventurar a que me venga a hacer la peña en rodar non se tenga. Accordingly, the narrator refers to the trotting of his messenger woman as a santo viaje and warns her not to take an errant path, but to stay on the main road, non tomes el sendero, y dejes la carrera. The narrator gets lost along the way more than once, as his failed seduction of the Basil Cruz, his mock crusade and journey on the Via Crucis, and his would-be pilgrimage in the Sierra. He moves in and out of sacred spaces, mapping out the peninsula as a place defined by penitent repasts of fish, barrels of wine, raw and cured meats, to include a boar named Ali. The poem describes the personified figure of Carnal riding out of town, as we heard yesterday, on a rabbi's donkey, driven from Toledo in exile among the Moors during Lent, but then making his way back into the episcopal see in a travesty Christian procession complete with kosher butchers. In the case of the rogation that I've been discussing, the narrator's deviant, ceaseless itinerary moves into a space mapped out by the church, figured as an unmoving widow and as a body of believers in motion, reciting a litany that pleads not only for an earthly bounty in fields, but also a fruitful crop of baptized Christians as the Easter season comes to a close. Further insights into the dynamics of space in the Libro can be gleaned from considering the recent work of scholars such as Marcus Stock and Nicola Beringer, who reevaluate medieval space as, quote, culturally negotiated rather than assuming a stable and fixed entity. Such approaches have focused on modes of manipulating and, quote, subverting space, and thereby creating multiple coexisting and overlapping spatialities. In such studies, a primary point of departure is Foucault's well-known lecture of other spaces. This influential text made a distinction between modern, open, and more abstracted understandings of spatial experience and medieval notions thought to be defined by fixed hierarchical relationships between the sacred and profane. Foucault further described the organization of these hierarchies on the basis of their status as protected versus exposed, urban as opposed to rural, celestial, or terrestrial. Like mobility and immobility, these oppositions can be helpful for understanding the Libro. However, the representation of contrary spaces in the poem is not typically static or rigid, but characteristically open to ambivalence. The archpriest text thus confirms the findings of theorists who have looked beyond Foucault's notion of a pre-modern fixed order that starkly contrasts with modern ideas of openness, and begun to examine the importance of space as actualized and practiced in medieval culture. Consonant with these approaches, the way space creates meaning in the episode of Rogation and the Libro as a whole is through movement and mediation. The poet and poem are always on the move, moving on from stationary and closed spaces and meanings, and in the fibers with death and the limits of language and love. It is important to recognize that the spatial turn discussed by Stock and Boehringer, among others, was anticipated by scholars like Peter Brown, whose lectures emphasized movements through pre-modern space. Brown described a dynamic, in his lectures, described a dynamic network of cultic sites held together by the placement and translation of sacred spaces and objects. As he put it, worshipers received and participated in a therapy of distance, in which they could approximate themselves to the material presence and power of holiness or praesentium. Brown's reflections on the interactive organization of space can be productively compared to those of Hugo Hume, an earlier German medievalist who theorized the notion of a lived out and performing space through movement and the experience of entering churches and then experiencing the arts during those ages. The archpriest, for example, in his intimate and pathetic adoration of an unholy crus, or his personification of Lent as a vanquished pilgrim on the road to Jerusalem, plays creatively with the therapeutic power of distance and proximity. Like the interior, exterior, and surroundings of Gothic churches that Yoon describes, space in the Libro is at once too great and too small. Equally relevant for understanding this kind of spatiality in the poem is the work of Michel de Certeau, who makes a distinction between place and space, in which the former is a stable configuration, insofar as no two things occupy the same location, whereas the latter involves both intersections and movements deployed within it. For Certeau, space, like the spoken word, is contingent on the ambiguity of actualization. Mobility transforms and manipulates spatialities, just as the act of speaking actualizes a system of linguistic signs and allows for performance and subversion. In the episode I've been discussing, the poet's redeployment of rogative language and evocation of a procession to bless and mark boundaries are subverted through a similar process. Just as a Latin prayer is slightly vernacularized, space is ironically actualized. Comparing itself to a ball that must stay in motion, the Libro plays with the significance of movements through the mediating dynamism of its poetics, exploring the thresholds and byways, whether they lead into churches, through city streets, into the mountains, or through the door of a widow's house. Thank you.